turn. Wait. Sorry, is this loud enough? You can hear that, right?
Okay. I think at least one POI from closing opposition. My voice is a bit clear, so I'm just going to be looking. Okay. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. It is blatantly insulting that the IMF thinks that they can make decisions better than the people of nations themselves. The simple case I will bring to you from opening government is threefold. First of all, it is extremely important for you to control things like subsidies and exchange rates in order to develop your nation. In the context in which opening opposition and closing opposition prove that this is going to coincide with your interests economically, I believe you will be able to convince them better when you have an incentive to do so as the IMF creating better buying. But second of all, alternatives. If you are being told that the only way you can get loans is to give up your electoral incentives, in other words, not give fertilizer subsidies to farmers, not give things like interest rates to people who need it, you will be voted out and move to worse alternatives like China and local vendors. And third of all, financial volatility and why op risks are priceless. First of all, some framing. Some governments are quite corrupt in the sense that their central banks to a large extent are captured by their own governments in the first place. Other governments are often quite more competent, like the government in Indonesia, which often has had an independent central bank people have respected for quite a few years. Note this debate operates on both of these metrics. First of all, let's talk about Op's best case, incompetent governments that require the IMF to make good decisions for them. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that they will simply stop taking loans, and it's extremely important to understand why this is the case. Sure, quickly.
Yeah, the motion states you still have anti-corruption. Like,
yeah.
I mean, that's probably the case that they'll be dissuaded to trade in other.
I mean, like, that's a POI. But anyway, the corruption point is obviously not as important because explicit corruption is often something that governments are willing to give up when they're having instability. What they're not willing to give up is their capacity to change anything at all within the economy. For example, even if I'm an incompetent government that thinks like authoritarianism is good, I need to control the central bank, I still believe I can save the economy, even if that means I have to give up corruption in the process. So I don't think this POI works. First of all, why is this tipping point for them just rejecting IMF loans and taking worse alternatives in the first place? First of all, note that if your future loans can no longer give you things like agricultural subsidies, the vast majority of your electorate is frustrated and angry at you. This looks like farmers' unions and trade unions. This looks like the narrative of the working class farmer that is extremely powerful in the media in the first place. As a result, the short-term electoral incentive overrules the incentive on opposition to get that loan in the first place, no matter how desperate you are. But second of all, note that this also makes you look extremely weak in nations where your actual strength against the idea of Westernism is very important. Because a lot of these are post-colonial nations. You know, the Indians don't really love the British telling them what to do. As a result, often it looks a bit bad when you're literally listening to the IMF telling you what to do and things are extremely unpopular and you're blaming them as an excuse in the first place. But third of all, it's important because even if there are competent governments who think this is a good decision in the first place, the incompetent ones will end up switching on side opposition, which is enough to win us this debate on the first picture. What does this mean? First of all, they'll probably switch to China. Note while China is still expanding the BRI. First of all, because their local economy has floundered recently, it doesn't mean they stop investing externally. They need to invest externally because there's not that much growth happening locally. They often have to dump huge amounts of exports into local businesses or get jobs by building infrastructure elsewhere. So expanding the amount of loans they give to other people. But second of all, it's because they need to show returns to the population because policy has been a threat. So often they need to make sure these loans are tighter and make sure the loans go to these people in the first place. As a result, often Chinese loans will be taken by these nations that are often authoritarian. As a result, there's a huge bad impact to this. The first one is obviously that their infrastructure often gets stolen and they can no longer control their basic needs and assets in the future. But second of all, it's just a much more untrustworthy actor because China's legal system is not independent, which means often the rates and the trade deals within them often get screwed over. But third of all, China is less likely to be a multilateral actor, so the resources that China takes over are not going to be connected by other nations that work within them. The second possibility is that they take local loans. For example, you probably still need money to give subsidies to get elected, right? So you might loan from local banks. The impact of this is, first of all, inflation. This is what happened in places like, Turkey, where obviously they were very, very anti the idea of taking more loans. So they started literally just reducing interest rates in order to solve inflation because they were making bad policy decisions. And so often the local lending made huge problems occur in the economy. But the logical like the logic of this is that if you take a huge amount of money from banks, which you cannot pay back because you as a government often earn money back in like decades, the people whose savings are in that bank often start to disappear because they don't have the safety of making sure that they can pull out that money. And as this increases, the banks become more and more over-leveraged, trying to pay you back by lending from other international institutions. First, the entirety of your economy loses legitimacy because any money any business makes can be taken away by the government because it desperately needs it. But second of all of these banks, when they keep lending you money, often become more and more leveraged to the point where if you don't pay that back, it can cause a bank run because people can be afraid that their money will never come back to them, at which point often you risk a financial crisis as well. Second of all, what happens to competent governments and their deficits in terms of development and in terms of financial stability? Before that, closing opposition?
So all these signs point to like, this sounds like a really dumb decision for the IMF to make. Why is it they keep doing it anyway?
Because if the country defaults, then you get more money back, right? They have to keep taking loans, keep paying on interest rates. But second of all, this is about a capacity thing, right? The IMF cannot just control the decisions every country makes. On your side, you have to forcefully put these conditions in, and at that point, they can't just be like, don't go to China, otherwise we'll invade you. Obviously, it's outside of their control. Okay, now, development and why it's really important to be able to control your exchange rates as well as your interest rates. First of all, this is often the only growth vehicle for these countries. Note the prerequisite to this is why the political context in these countries are good in the first place. I've already told you if it's often like authoritarian and corrupt, then probably opposition has a bad impact in terms of alternatives. The system is probably to some extent fair in the motion where this applies, where this loan is taken. What does that mean? First, they know what's happening on a local ground. People understand which sectors need support and which sectors need subsidies. Often, that is fertilizers in agriculture. Sometimes it's not, in which case debate doesn't matter. But in many instances, it's important because these farmers need that money to keep selling in the first place. That means you can build up cash reserves to invest into the future. In the current context, this is even more important because guess what? The biggest shortage in the world right now is food, because Ukraine has been invaded as well as COVID cutting off supply chains. So often it's a really high rate to make money to sell these primary resources. But second of all, let's say you don't sell that many primary resources, you're not a farming nation, and you're moving to middle income countries. You want to move into manufacturing. As a result, often you need to also change your exchange rates. You might need to import more primary materials in order to sell that as a finished product, for which you need your exchange rate to rise so you can afford those imports in the first place. You cannot do that on side opposition. You get all that optionality on our side. But third of all, it's important to provide capital controls because the risk on opposition is too much. The reason the East Asian financial crisis was such a big hit to the country was because when the currency starts falling to some extent and the economy is failing, people speculate on it. They buy huge amounts of it. This is what a market exchange rate means, by the way. As a result, if the currency falls 20% in Indonesia, despite the economy still being quite healthy, people speculated on the rupee until it gained down 67% because that makes them more money. You cannot have capital controls on side opposition. You can control that on our side and stop this. This is immediately winning because exchange rates literally decide every single thing you do in your everyday life. At the point where your currency becomes devalued, you cannot buy goods or save money. Your savings are wiped out. You have nothing returned in the first place. But second of all, investments within your country determine the interest rate. At the point where there's a market exchange rate, you cannot take away that interest rate, which means that often people can pull money out of your nation very easily. So often companies are invested in because right now there's growth, the second there's a harm, people pull out that money, which means the entire company can no longer function, causing the entire economy to often have huge shocks that come permeate throughout it in the first place. The only way to control that is on our side, on that opening up.
Alright, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We welcome the Leader of Opposition to start the opening opposition case. Yeah.
Is the panel ready?
Yeah.
Four broad claims from opening up in this debate. First, a point of framing as to why the lack of IMF conditionality induces unfavorable market conditions that cause serious harm to these countries, regardless of the existence of anti-corruption provisions. Second, why each of these policies are good in and of themselves. Third, why in the absence of these additional conditions, the anti-corruption reforms they talk about on their side become toothless. And finally, I'll explain why this makes countries more resilient to recessions with this policy. Before that, three extraneous responses to remove OG from the round. OG's first claim is that countries on the margins are more likely to turn to China, at the point at which some countries, which are on the fence between trading with BRI and participating in things like the IMF, are now seeing that the conditions are too stringent. There are three broad intuitive reasons why not, even disregarding the fact that there's things like status quo bias, governments that have close political ties with the West outside the IMF that induce them not to turn to China, and the fact that these countries often have economies that are interlinked with the West such that they don't want to turn to China to avoid pissing them off, even if it's the case, so they want to stay half dependent on the IMF for those reasons. Firstly, China has significantly more limited resources right now. They're reeling from COVID, and they're also reeling from an internal inward whereby they're developing the domestic market. Every investment they project outward trades off against Xi Jinping's capacity to reinvest locally and domestically. Shaurya says the exports become more competitive and therefore they can reinvest the money from the exports domestically. The problem is people are buying far fewer and inflation is up and they're relatively less competitive compared to other countries. So it's unlikely to be China as an alternative. Secondly, China's also pissed off a large number of countries. The very stock analysis about debt trap diplomacy, whereby China seized a port in Gwadar, Pakistan, and also in Sri Lanka, and things like that, has largely dissuaded a lot of countries from trading with China. So for countries on the fence, they're very unlikely to say, some conditions that require us to remove a few competitive advantages for our market versus China trapping us in debt and then literally stealing our port and occupying our land are two very different things. So the weighing is quite clear, right? Finally, if their logic is true, they're still at a competitive deficit with China. So if there are some countries on the fence that are really leaning China and the status quo and things like this, they're still going to be put off from the IMF by anti-corruption reforms. Why are anti-corruption reforms the most salient? Quite obviously, because anti-corruption reforms could force the political party out of power, and the people in these countries want to stay in power longer. Therefore, they are very likely to just turn to China on their side if that's something that happens. Finally, path dependency. It's very hard to reorient your entire economy toward China. If you do this, you likely piss off the West and lose out on Western investors as a result of moving towards China. See if Pakistan when they did this and the port and water thing, and so things like this. But more importantly, I just think it's generally quite bad. The final thing I think that OG then says is that you need to control your eastern trades. The problem with this is this just scares off massive amounts of investment intuitively. Like, look, capital controls are often very, very bad. They don't just protect domestic industry, they're used to keep domestic and corrupt monopolies in power that can then pressure the government to get preferential regulations on their side of the house. On our side of the house, we break those capital controls to allow more entrance into the market, which induces competitiveness, while simultaneously reducing the amount of money that these companies have to do things like lobby the government for preferential policy. The final point I want to make is that the banks become more unstable. It's very clearly and intuitively the opposite, right? Because Shaurya says there is a lack of central bank credibility. If that is true, this means international investors are incredibly unlikely to want to invest because they are worried about the regime of the central bank changing fairly rapidly. The reason why the Mexican peso crisis happened was because international investors pulled out en masse of Mexico at the point at which the government under Peña Nieto set an interest rate peg to a specific point, and then the next government immediately reversed that. When you no longer can do that, you're set constant to market rates, this induces investor confidence. The first thing I want to establish in framing is that there are 6 problems with lack of anti-IMF conditionality, even should anti-corruption reforms remain constant. First, in the absence of policies that eliminate subsidies on fuel and fertilizer subsidies, you allow dominant firms to crowd out these vital markets. The reason why a single firm has been able to monopolize the Mexican market is because they are significantly able to take advantage of the differential in terms of subsidies to crowd out other potential firms to enter and create competition. Secondly, in the absence of setting your currency exchange rate to international market rates, there's less credibility in your central bank. The reason this is true structurally is because without the guarantee your exchange rate or your currency will remain constant over a period of time, investors are more concerned about losing domestic capital that they suck away in there. But thirdly, market-based interest rates, rather than the comparative, crowd out the ability for businesses to get loans, because when banks set interest rates preferentially and give better rates to some companies, this crowds out competition within the market to a vastly greater extent. But even if you have equal competition, when interest rates are not pegged to market, they cannot take into account when it's best to borrow, which means it's hard for companies with long-term time horizons to make plans when they want to take out loans, when it's the best time to take on debt. This predictability is the most vital. The second thing I want to do is explain why the conditions are unlikely to be so stringent that these countries can't meet them and they will be reasonable. This is the most important mechanism. The IMF does not want to push countries away from receiving the packages because they face economic contagion as a result of there's a harm as a result of these countries not accepting the packages and then their economy getting fucked. Economic contagion spreads across borders and this causes harm to countries that receive the loan as well. Secondly, the IMF is based on a large number of countries and is made up of a number of constituent governors from many countries. Therefore, there is likely to be a race to the median whereby over time the policy of the IMF congeals around a reasonable set of conditions and circumstances. The upshot of all of this is, and finally, they do have competition with China, so there's an incentive for the conditions to largely be reasonable. So they want countries to rely on them not turn toward China, who's not going to impose really terrible conditions that governments just reject. The upshot of all of this are the structural reasons why it's likely to be good and not going to be absurdly stringent, like what they're defending. Second, why is it the case these countries will still be receptive to these conditions? Firstly, people in power in these countries can gain credibility by appealing to this, because they can point to the credibility induced by the West in order to remain in power. But secondly, it dampens populism, because if we get more investment on our side of the house, which can have a positive feedback loop whereby they like the IMF more. But finally, I think that corruption is usually the most proximate harm, because they don't want to defend or remove all conditions. So at that point, I don't think they get the benefit that they want on their side of the house. Why do we resolve investment inefficiencies in the markets of developing countries? This is the most important argument in this debate, and it's logically prior to anything CO can extend on, insofar as this is the prerequisite for all of these countries to attain economic stability. The problem in the status quo with investment is threefold. Investors lack market confidence about entering countries and setting up shop there because of lack of market-based interest rates, because they fear subsidies, dominant competitors, crowding out competition, and so on. The second fear is a lack of central bank credibility, as I've already explained. And the final fear is that many developing countries are transitioning away from manufacturing sector and towards sectors like information technology and things like this. The problem is that it's slowed down on their side when you have a massive amount of subsidies that a few dominant companies hoard, which discourages competition and innovation. Why do we fix all of things? Before that, I'll take closing. Opening.
Okay, your argument is that currently people believe that these conditions are not met, these countries are extremely volatile. The IMF now says they will continue to develop these countries even if they don't meet them.
This is what happens on your side of the house in the absence of conditions. Those are the investment inefficiencies that exist in the absence of this policy. Why do we get significantly more international investment then? I think firstly, investors feel now more they are able to compete with with domestic firms more frequently. This means they come in more frequently, set up shops, the government gets things like a broader tax base from the ability for these investors to come in, and their benefits proliferate downstream, right? Because now people have more goods to choose from, more people have the ability to meet their preferences, more people have the benefits to access goods and services that they otherwise would never get. But secondly, when exchange rates aren't floating and are rather pegged to international markets, investors are less worried about holding assets in the currency the country issues. What this does is then prop up the valuation of that currency. But it also means when they hold reserves in the local currency, it means they're more likely to keep profits in the country rather than reallocating those elsewhere. So international plunder, if you believe investment happens on either side, is substantially reduced on our side, at the point at which now countries have an incentive to keep the money in circulation within the domestic economy, as opposed to just raiding it, exporting it out, and taking it away to the US or something like that. But finally, when you get more competition between firms, it means you get vastly more innovation within the country. This aids and speeds the transition process at the point at which these things happen. Why are these policies beneficial in and of themselves? We get decreasing monopolization on our side of the house. We get exchange rate consistency on our side of the house. And we get less implicit corruption, most critically, which is the final point I want to make. I'm going to do more on that. When there's way less regulatory oversight, quite intuitively, there's more leverage to engage in kind of pay-for-play and under-the-table corruption that gets far worse on their side. So you don't resolve the problems that they want to, whereas we do. Incredibly practical from my opinion.
We thank the leader of opposition for that speech. This way. All right, we welcome the BPM to conclude the OG case. Yeah.
Okay. I guess no one else did it. I'm gonna do it. Couple of shout outs. Hi kids at home. You're watching even though it's like 2 a.m. Go to bed. Thank you. Also shout out to my debate mentors who's told me a lot because I think world sport is pretty impressive. In no particular order, Leung Fat, Michael Algi, Wang Chandun, Jack Tai, and Benjamin Go. Cool. Don't shout out the word too. I can shout out again. Okay, good. Okay. Alright. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'm going to do is prove why the economy is significantly worse on their side of the house, and that in and of itself is a way for us to win the debate. There's two things I want to flag out. Even in the best case in which development happens over time, the first thing you want to know is what Shaurya said, which is to say you get rid of the ability for specific countries to hedge against things like exogenous shocks, which is significant because Matt is not intellectual genius. Matt cannot predict whether or not the next COVID happens, whether or not there's natural disaster that leads to things, for example, like supply shocks, or just like any other thing that leads to the ebbs and flows of economic shocks leading to specific countries being harmed. The distinction, therefore, then, is that on our side of the house there's a high degree of flexibility. Because even if Matt is correct that the IMF has structural incentive to make sure that things like interest rate or things like currency exchange is done in a fairly reasonable rate, our argument was simple. Even if the IMF's good, the local politicians are significantly better. A, because they have flexibility and they're able to move it around. IMF definitionally by the info slide has a one-size-fits-all solution. Unless Ahmed can prove why India is the same as Bangladesh, I don't think they're going to win this clash. But second and more significantly, there's just a plethora of reasons as to why politicians have good incentives, which beats back against their claim. Honestly, I think it is a bit elitist and problematic to assume that a lot of these countries we're talking about don't have the ability to make good enforcement. But there are a lot of structural reasons as to why there are good incentives. Number one, oftentimes the way in which it works is that the politicians or the individuals who work in local bureaus are the experts from these countries. So individuals, for example, working in the Indian Bureau of Economics are the best people in India to deal with economic things. But second of all, there's ample electoral incentives because it's unclear why economic growth is not a contentious economic issue, right? Like no one ever was like, hey, I'm going to sink the Indian economy now, please vote for me. Everyone wants the economy to be good, so there's automatically going to be a race to the top, and individuals on the ground have local nuances that help them determine whether or not specific policies are good. Which then was the problem, because on their side, big bad guy in the IMF gets to decide why fertilizer subsidies, for example, might be gone, or why specific exchange rate was good or bad. On our side of the house, that decision was always with the individuals on the ground, and that was significant. But finally, and this is significant, even in the best case, the issue on their side is that the considerations are always economic. You know what else harms individuals? When social problems lead to individuals starving. When other types of issues that are not strictly to do with monetary policy, etc., make significant degrees of harm to your society. On our side of the house, politicians care about those because if you have poverty, for example, that leads to you losing elections. So the consideration on our side of the house is significantly bigger, and therefore the individual politicians are going to be better. The way up on this argument is very simple. Massive amount of individuals suffer interim harms in which things like social policy cannot be meaningfully redirected because the IMF arbitrarily imposes specific conditions on these countries. The flexibility allows for the interim harm to be better. This is logically hard in opening up because even if you buy the long-term argument, people die now. People hungry now. They matter. And as a result of that, we're winning on the principle there. But the second thing we told you, and this is significant, was just to say that the monetary stability and the perception that states have that stability was important for states to buy into the IMF, which is quite significant. Because if opening opposition is right, that China is on the way, which by the way I think Matt then self-contradicts in the LO, then where else do you get that money? And the issue then was that on their side of the house, individual countries can always use the rhetoric that we want Indian sovereignty, we want sovereignty for these countries and therefore not opt into the IMF. We get rid of all of those incentives for the very simple reason Shaurya gives, which is that being corrupt is oftentimes a very scandalous sort of thing, and therefore countries don't want to be corrupt. So when the only condition the IMF imposes is whether or not you're corrupt or not, there is ample incentive on our side for massive degrees of opt-in, which is the logic and prerequisite to getting the economic benefits as well. But even if you don't buy this, why is it that the type of economic development you got on their side of the house significantly worse? The first thing I just want to put out here is they never prove why the money stays in, right? Like if a bunch of foreign companies come in and therefore start consolidating power, I think what ends up happening is that domestic firms die. Why is this likely to be the case? Number one, often these big firms have first mover advantages. They have already established things, for example, like technology. They already have, for example, specific supply chains and all of these sorts of things. But secondarily, they're oftentimes just able on scale to appeal to a bigger market. And the asymmetry of power and economies of scale means that bigger companies that are coming in are oftentimes going to be significantly more able to compete. But second of all, the reason as to why this is bad is because then this ends up crowding out domestic businesses. Because what ends up happening when big companies are coming in, because definitionally they stand for things like free market, is that big companies are able to make sure that individuals on the ground either A, just have higher prices in the long term, because if you monopolize the market, you then are able to charge whatever prices you want. No, thank you. But second of all, you necessarily retard the development of these local industries for the very simple reason that if a consumer can choose between buying a cheaper product that is made by an MNC that's able to make that price cheaper because of some cost and stuff, they're always going to buy that. And as a result of that, the domestic firms are always going to suffer. What is the way up on this argument? The first thing I want to point out is, I don't think opening opposition ever has a path to victory in the long run. At best, they just say, well, money now goes like around the world. I don't know why this is a good thing. If a bunch of American firms go to India, make massive degrees of profit, and then send that money away, I think that is a bad thing because you create higher degrees of volatility in places like India. But second of all, it makes it far harder for the state to develop because if MNCs can flexibly move capital around, it just makes it hard for the state to plan how much tax revenue and all of these things you're going to get. But three, flip your argument on corruption, because you know how corruption happens when big MNCs are able to consolidate power and tell the government to do whatever they want. Otherwise, you're going to pull out. We're able to get rid of that because we preemptively set up things, for example, like protectionism. This will allow our side of the house, the economy over time is going to be better. Maybe we don't get massive degrees of growth, but when individual governments who understand the local nuances can control the degree and the way in which that growth happens, we're able to create sustainable development, which is probably better not only on an economic term, but also in terms of people's feelings. Because if you have massive degrees of inequality, even if growth is good now, but now you're living in poverty tomorrow, that is not very good. Closing.
So it sounds to me like you have two contradictory premises about the incentives of governments. Either they are super duper pushed by one particular bloc and rebellion might be threatened, or they have all the competent incentives which will make all the best decisions.
They can be competent but still pushed. The reason why they're pushed is because of opening opposition's policy. Thank you for pointing out that opening op is losing. Great. What is the long term and why are we able to win as well? The opening op claim here was that you got a race to the median and therefore that is a good thing. I want to point out, even if over time the IMF policies become better, our argument was that the lack of flexibility in and of itself was a harm. What are the two ways in which this plays out? The first is just the net amount of sum that the IMF has to work with over time decreases. Think about what happens on our side. Because right now, a lot of companies or countries are performing suboptimally because they have to cater to the four demands on the inflow side. On our side, there is only one demand, and it's not even an economic demand, which means you're able to immediately do things like have protectionist policies, or immediately do things like restructure the way in which your economy works. So the ability for you to make that money back is significantly quicker. This is important because now you can pay the IMF back, which does three things. Number one, this creates a signal that the IMF says all we care about is anti-corruption. So you get higher degrees of investor confidence because people think that no, these countries aren't actually that bad. The IMF approves of them. But second and more importantly, it also just means there's more money the IMF has writ large. Because the issue on their side is that if these companies or these countries are failing, then they don't have the ability to pay back the IMF, and therefore the IMF is working on deficit. But finally, this is important over time. Because often, people don't work with the IMF because of a perception that the IMF screws them over. We're able to rectify that by making it seem as though the IMF is on your side. So they don't turn to the other alternative that Shaurya talked about are bad. At the end of the day, economic development is far easier on our side. Very happy to want to know you.
Yes.
3, 2, 1. They presume that they can get better policies because the politicians have optimal interests on our side. What I'm going to explain to you right now is even with the best interests, there's a structural incapacity to acclimate and harmonize those interests to create optimal market policies for everyone, including them. A few things. Why are these conditions likely to not be too restrictive like in the 80s? Matt tells you a few things. They have a fear of economic contagion, the fact that they don't want them to go to China, and it's largely participatory. But two things as well. One, note that there's an institutional learning capacity, that is to say they've literally released reports saying you learned from our mistakes in the 90s. But secondarily, it's about having aggregate information about other countries and the ability to harmonize conditions across the board. Even if you as a politician want to, for example, maximize the profit potential for your country, you cannot know or predict how another developing country is going to shift those interest rates and currencies relative to yours. Why can countries not make proper optimal decisions? Firstly, internal issues. One note, politicians at a structural level are short-termists that have short-term cycles. And secondarily, the discipline is harder on their side because institutions, even if the incentives are perfect, are not fully or entirely developed. Even with independent central banks, it takes years to develop that institutional know-how and that independence. What is the upshot of this? They say, they know their country's better. One, I think it's likely the IMF still has robust policy analysis and people on the ground to provide that info in that context. But the issue that they don't engage with, Matt, is this is an inability to align selfish interests. They might say, I do care about my people and want to empower them, but they want to get elected in the next election. That is to say there might be interests that they have to prioritize and gamble, but the one that they prioritize is the short-term one that isn't optimal. But here's the second issue, and that's more critical. There are external issues outside of the control of politicians. That is to say, there's coordination problems they have with different countries. That is to say, there's a prisoner's dilemma and information asymmetry between how another country is going to exchange their currency relative to yours, and the kinds of subsidies that they will put in their market that will affect the capacity for you to export your own market. The upshot, and secondly, there's uncertainty for investors because situations can still change on the ground quickly. What is the upshot of this? Even with the perfect government incentives, and even if they're not short-term, they cannot aggregate the incentives with other countries that leads to suboptimal international market conditions that affects everyone. The upshot of this is that these are the conditions that create the shocks and the crises they talk about. When a country lowers its prices so low, and then, for example, a tsunami hits or a typhoon hits, and then the market, they cannot sell to another country and fuck up the supply chain. In other words, even if they are angels that cannot talk to one another. We would prefer to have a less reputable or more impartial devil that is able to aggregate the interest between those states. But secondarily, I think they're comparatively more susceptible to financial crises on their sides. Why? One, a volatile currency means that as that currency goes down, which they have an incentive to insofar as they're export based on what to export and the crisis hits, it's harder for them to, for example, buy more reserves and have that liquidity as opposed to if it was a market-based rate that they can consistently plan for. Secondarily, it's easier for countries to devalue your currency when it's floating as opposed to a fixed market rate that the IMF is able to do with multiple countries at the same exact time. And thirdly, you're more resilient to shocks, comparatively more in our side, because when your currency is so low, you're not able to, for example, provide goods and services for your people, or provide subsidies for that company to then sell on the market stage. It's comparatively harder because your currency isn't otherwise worth shit. The upshot of this is that economic shocks might be symmetric on either side. The differences there are the conditions and product of countries misaligning interests and having incentives that are zero-sum with other countries. IMF maybe doesn't have each individual country's personal best interest, but they have an aggregate best interest that is comparatively more able to harmonize, even if it leads to suboptimal decisions between some countries, and then, for example, not making as much money as possible in the short term. Then they say, you'll go to China. I think this is largely out of this debate, insofar as one, all the stuff Matt told you, but the other thing I say is one, they have a large amount of bad loans that they have that they've been trying to defer for the last few decades as they've been taking America's bad debt. Secondarily, they can't be everywhere, right? They just can't be everywhere and loan to anyone. Thirdly, they have a domestic focused priority over their own citizens than to lend to other countries. But fourthly, they cannot developing countries cannot entirely reshape their economy to then engage with China more, as far as they have different supply chains. Now, let me weigh investment. And here's why it's it's critical. The investment that Matt tells you is a prerequisite to development, things like roads, electric grids, etc. But secondarily, it's far more wide scale and affects a wider sector of the country as opposed to domestic companies where even if they reserve more wealth, they don't have as much money as a foreign country. So even if, for example, you don't get to keep as much of the money, they give you the startup capital that allows you to do things that trickle down, like build hospitals for workers or an electric grid that even if somebody isn't having a job, at least they can access the internet. But fourthly, these are generalizable. All countries to some extent can and need international investment. The upshot of all of this is that even if they get comparatively more protectionist policies on their side, I don't know why it is comparatively better or why it has to the foreign investment that they otherwise need to upscale comparatively more. Even if they had to hoard more of the money and they have more of the pie, it is a smaller pie that is far less able to be redistributed to more people. Now, I want to gauge very clearly. Even if you buy that investment is symmetric and countries want access to these loans, why are the policies they compel them to itself substantially more efficient? One, subsidies prop up monopolies even if they are non-corrupt. Why are they able to access these subsidies far more than smaller companies domestically? One, intuition pump, they have more lobbying power to access it. But secondarily, even if you subsidize everyone equally, the marginal value of a subsidy is far greater to a bigger company. Why? Because they can use each additional subsidy to crowd out and pickpocket the markets that the small company wants to enter. The upshot is this engages with OO on monopolization and says why it's comparatively easier for them with the policies that IMF is trying to prevent that benefits the bigger companies they're trying to root out. Before getting into the second piece of analysis, back up, Kevin.
Yeah, it's not clear to me why these subsidies necessarily favor just bigger companies, because these bigger companies often don't use these subsidies to lower prices heavily on the local population.
I just explained to you why they're able to weaponize it comparatively more than smaller companies, but the difference is that when you're able to comparatively reduce subsidies across the board, you're able to aggregate prices comparatively better. See the previous analysis behind that. Secondarily, this creates more avenues for inefficient investment and funding. Why? Firstly, currency arbitrage. When you have floating exchange rates, investors and domestic companies make money on price differentials with other currencies as opposed to making a better or cheaper good. So when there's a floating currency exchange rate that isn't harmonized, it's far easier for me as a person to say, I'm going to start a business and make money by selling one good in another country and by purchasing it to a different one because I can take advantage of the price volatility, as opposed to actually starting a business that employs people and makes things better. But secondarily, these are more volatile kinds of investment. As currency spikes might be very profitable, but these are short-term businesses. These aren't things like the incentives we tell you about an electric grid that has long-term profit potential. But thirdly, it creates worse trade barriers and tariffs. Why? Because subsidies are zero-sum against competing countries internationally. The upshot of this is that even if they benefit each individual country in the short term, you increase prices across the market, and countries are not islands, even if some of them may be. They buy and engage with other countries, their prices are affected by the international market. Look, the IMF is no angel, but I'd rather have one devil coordinating the market than 20 angels that cannot communicate or have the same incentives. I think it's a clear road.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now welcome the Member of Government to start the closing half of this debate. Here.
Closing government is going to win this debate by first giving you a realistic characterization of how the economies of these countries that might be needing IMF loans work. And second of all, giving you a characterization of what exactly the political system works in these kinds of countries and why the decision makers are actually better than the IMF. So firstly, a couple of pieces of framing. OG says that their biggest push with the biggest impact is literally countries trying alternatives, for example, China, for example, doing local bond issuing. OGO does a pretty good job refuting this, but there are just some reasons why the IMF is actually the first choice that these countries turn to. Firstly, that there is just empirically evidence that countries like to accept IMF loans. For example, Ghana has recently complied with these demands and accepted IMF loans. Second of all, in the short term, political leaders really care about defaults. When they default on their debts, it's extremely damaging to both them politically, but also damaging to the country's economy because you're literally going to have a debt crisis when you're trying to restructuring loans with too many debtors. So not going to China and getting a fresh BRI loan is going to take way too long, whereas the IMF's offer is probably more realistic. But third of all, their mechanism for turning to China is farmers loving subsidies and voting out governments that do not love subsidies. But they never proved that farmers actually like fertilizer subsidies, and we are going to give you a more realistic characterization of what farmers want and what is going to play out in this scenario. Firstly, our first piece of extension is going to be the harms of abolishing subsidies, and this is the most important, more important than OG's arguments, because both for countries that still rely on subsistence farming, which is a lot of countries, and for those who are moving from subsistence farming to manufacturing, the really important thing is to keep agricultural productivity up. What happens to agricultural productivity when subsidies are abolished? First thing I'm going to say is that subsidies are the thing that governments uses to encourage the use of fertilizer over organic methods to fuel, fuel like LNG over wood fire. Why is this case? Firstly, fertilizer is extremely expensive. Compared to cow manure that you can just get from the cow that helps you till your land, fertilizer is not an option that people generally want to use if it is expensive. Second of all, fertilizer is generally a new thing that gets introduced to a place. Often it's only introduced in the past few decades after decolonization, after thousands of generations of people farming on their farms using organic methods. But third of all, fertilizer is often seen as something that is Western, right? Fertilizer is monopolized by Western companies that export into your countries. It is seen as some sort of alien invasion on your traditional methods of farming, and therefore people do not prefer to use fertilizer. In reality, fertilizer is very demand elastic, which means that farmers do not want to use fertilizer, but they are choosing to when, one, government officials are encouraging the use of fertilizer when selling their subsidies policies on fertilizer, but two, fertilizer is literally subsidized and now way cheaper. These are the only circumstances in which farmers choose to use this fertilizer. But what happens to countries when farmers stop using fertilizer and fertilizer demand drops? The first thing that happens is land consolidation. When fertilizer is extremely expensive and it can only be afforded by large collectivized farms, farmers that have more capital buy up other farmlands of other farmers, and those farmers become renters on the farmland rather than owners of this farmland. Why is this bad? For two reasons. First of all, there is increased inequality, obviously, when one farmer who was very rich in the first place buys up all the farmland in the area, and now that farmer is also getting rent from the farmers who have to rent the land in order to till it. But second of all, there is reduced productivity because there's no longer competition between different family farms that all want to produce a lot to sell to the same kinds of importers. But now there's one person who is producing, and people are getting complacent because they're not the one who own the farmland, but they're simply tilling the farmland of someone they're renting the farmland from. There might be a claim from opposing opposition of economies of scale and how improvements happen when there are consolidation, but that is negligible because farmers often already band together to get materials to farm, so that can happen on our side as well. But also in a lot of developing countries, economies of scale in farming is generally not achievable because the really big equipment that the US uses to develop economies of scale in farming is way too expensive and not accessible to these farmers. But the second thing that happens is there is generally less productive farming, which hinders the transition to manufacturing. So the thing that happens when you don't use fertilizer and you use cow manure is that yield drops massively. Sri Lanka literally had a national crisis when people were partying in the president's mansion because people stopped using fertilizer and the whole economy got destroyed. So when the farmers stop using fertilizer and the yield drops, that is when labor demand goes way up because decreased labor productivity has to be compensated by higher labor inputs. So a ton of people are now trapped in subsistence farming in their hometown villages rather than moving to the cities/manufacturing hubs because the young labor stock now feels like their family farm needs them. Before I go on, closing.
Even assuming this round was just a farm field, encouraging the use of fertilizer can also be incredibly damaging when they use low-quality fertilizer that over-nitrates the soil and makes it unproductive in long term.
Well, no, even if you use low-quality fertilizer that is better than cow manure, which literally makes your land fuck up. Okay, so this has long-term impacts because even if one generation of young men for 1 year thinks their family farm needs them and takes over and starts being the family head that manages his family farm, it is unlikely that 5 years later suddenly they choose to go to a manufacturing hub because now they're locked into subsistence farming. Extremely bad for the development of these countries. There's also a massive drop in food supplies and also a massive disruption to the development trends that are good for this country. Second piece of extension, why governments have good incentives versus the IMF. OG has 2 reasons for why governments are better at making decisions and 0 for why the IMF is bad at making decisions and therefore is vulnerable to Ahmed's attack about the IMF being a good actor because they care about everyone. So the 2 reasons for why governments are good at making decisions are they have Indian experts because they're Indian, but also the IMF can employ Indian experts. I don't really understand this reason. But second of all, they say electoral incentives means that people care about the economy development in the long term, but they don't give any analysis for why actually people aren't short-termists and governments aren't short-termists, or they only care about privileged people who are rent seekers. Structural reasons for why governments are good at making economic decisions. First of all, often short-term costs of non-long-termist decisions worsen expectations. So when investors look at your short-termist decisions, they flee your market, and therefore you will not make short-termist decisions. Second of all, often governments are just long-termists because they care about the future and the legacy of their political party. They don't just want to be in power for 5 years and then never be in power again. The fourth law, elections in developing countries are often incredibly representative because they often intentionally boost turnout because people who turn out initially are usually uninformed and therefore vote for the incumbents. So incumbents are structurally incentivized to put voting booths every 2 kilometers like it happens in India. Well, fourthly, lobbying from domestic corporations evens out across parties. So some domestic corporations donate to one party and the other donates to the other party and it balances out so that companies usually do have the best interest of the economic development. On the IMF, contrarily, is usually captured by neoliberal interests such as the US. Usually there's no personal stake of the IMF people wanting economic development for these countries. And lastly, IMF resources are spread too thin. Usually they if they loan to Ghana, they can't loan to Nigeria. This is the reason we're proud of this.
We thank the member of government for that speech. We welcome the member of opposition to start the closing opposition.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, and... In what was exceptionally one of the rounds ever, closing opposition will make 2 very basic arguments. The first is that you simply massively widen the pool of loans. This is the core mechanism by which any team gets its benefit, and we're just going to show you at closing opposition why these are necessary prerequisites to have any creditors available in the first place. And secondly, we're going to do the incentives debate. We're going to say why, in most cases, this is a very, very good policy, but it's impossible to implement on government because this is an incentives black hole that makes it impossible to fund anything but agricultural and fuel subsidies, despite the fact that development is urgently more pressing in these countries. Before that, some direct response to closing government and their farm bill extension. So the first thing to point out is that this agricultural subsidy has a contrary effect on the price of food due to long-term inflation letting business at high prices, which means, just trivially speaking, right, this has the countervailing effect of just making food more and more expensive over time because you spend more on these subsidies. Secondly is that these subsidy incentives might incentivize fertilizer, but they reduce incentives for important landmark innovations like mechanized tractors or, more disease-resilient strains of, seeds, whatever. Which just shows that perhaps they might have some efficiencies in the short term, but they lose on more important long-term efficiencies. Thirdly is that you also create over-competition. The problem is that nutrients in topsoil are often very limited, and you force farmers to capitalize now on the subsidies, which means that they're forced to deplete subsidies for the long term. So how should we weigh these responses? The first is that we flip their impact directly, right? If their point is just that you have cheaper food, our point is that you make food substantially more scarce due to the direct mechanism they use. And secondly is that we guarantee, a stronger impact in terms of food scarcity. Because if you assure that fertilizer is to some degree good, the problem is that at some point this fertilizer will stop working, at some point you'll deplete all the nutrients in the topsoil, and the only way to feasibly actually provide these people food, water, electricity, and so on, is to provide the long-term incentives created through market mechanisms. Having said that, we move into the first extension. This extension should be very basic. The pool of capital increases because we're going to discuss the incentives of the creditor states that will otherwise never give money on government bench. These incentives are a prerequisite to have any states be willing to give you loans at all. First of all, return of investment. You necessarily need market-based interest rates on your currency as well as on the loans that you're willing to give, because the fact that there's a very good chance you simply set favorable interest rates to ensure that you get very, very easy and convenient repayments on your side, as well as inflate currency rates to pump up the value of your own currency to essentially make these loan repayments worthless but still meet the demands of the contract. Which means on government bench, you essentially set that rate of return of investment to essentially zero, which means creditors have very, very little incentive to offer loans on government bench because there are no prerequisite incentives for this. Secondly is that there's also a massive amount of risk. That is, you're exposed to electoral risk when things are primarily state-controlled. If it's not market-based, developing countries might, out of, random populism, or maybe, for whatever reason, like nobody's been able to structurally prove one way or the other which way countries go, but the matter of fact is that there's effectively uncertainty in the round about what these politicians will do, will show that you might have politicians like Erdogan or Bolsonaro destroy the interest rates of a country sporadically, which means this potentially destroys the capacity for them to pay back their loan or even just make basic commitments on the other things that they promise. Third thing finally is that these things also tend to have natural, destructive long-term consequences, whether it be the long-term inflation that this creates, or the depletion of the topsoil, and so on and so forth, which would in the long term reduce the natural capacity to pay these things back. Having said that then, the pool of capital in government massively decreases because the willingness of lender states massively decreases. When in terms, in the form of like, one, they actually need to make commitments back to the people on the ground, they have to explain why they're spending so much money on a state that will not pay this money back, or will give it back to them in worthless Mickey Mouse money, which essentially means that there are three impacts on government bench. The first is that in many cases they simply have no loans at all available for these countries, and in times where the need is most dire, such as in times of recession, the country simply collapses. Secondly is that the loans become in much smaller size, or they demand much higher repayment sizes, which means these countries are dragged into debt. It's much harder for them to make these payments back. They default and the economy collapses, or the loans are too small such that they're not able to meet the threshold necessary to pull the country out of recession. They might have some money, but it's not to build the highways, to build the electricity, to build all the important infrastructure needs that they need to survive, which means they might have some money, but that money goes to waste. But thirdly, finally, is that this creates incentives for predatory behavior on behalf of the IMF. If they cannot guarantee security in this way, then that's where they're forced to take opening government alternatives of trying to force these countries to default and get predatory collateral in order to get these resources back, which means it's on government bench where the overall loaning incentives get substantially worse. How should you situate these impacts within the round? The first way, and most clearly, is that this is a prerequisite point of material to basically every other team's impact, because if the loans are simply not available, they cannot get any of their benefits. Secondly, and more importantly, is that this deals with a much larger impact, which is that dealing with availability directly in times of crisis is the most important thing, because one, it means that if it's not available, when a country looks like it's about to go into crisis, people pull out and the country explodes, guaranteed, rather than having a chance of being pulled out. And beyond that, when the time of crisis actually comes, millions of people starve because the money is just not available. This is by far the largest impact in the round. This concludes the first argument, and it shows us not only do we provide the main mechanism by which anything in this debate could possibly happen, we also meet the main threshold, which is that how do you get people out of poverty? What are the needs of these developing countries? It is to be able to have that money and the loans available in the first place, so that even if Gov might use the loans for something good, they can't. Opening up.
Okay. The IMF doesn't care about how it's repaid, but on our side it's forced to negotiate with local economists and actually convince them of a policy instead of forcing a one-size-fits-all one on them. You might be right in some instances, we work in every instance, gaining the capacity that opening opposition thinks is winning.
Creditor states care about whether or not they're getting repaid, which means that, they will care about whether or not they join the IMF. And number two is that the IMF cares how are they going to get paid with their salaries. And thirdly is just, most trivially, right? If the countries don't repay, they make bad economic policies. The point of a loan will have been for naught. Okay, let's now move to the second piece of material, which is the incentives debate. But I want to observe that the first argument is immediately debate winning for the reasons I've given earlier, but also because it requires a lot less analytical belief, and it, just like takes the best piece of both teams. Maybe both teams are right, about some stuff about whether the loans are good or not. Okay, now we move on to the second argument, which is the point on incentives. So I think opening government and opening opposition and closing government are all plausibly right that in some cases these loans are bad, or in some cases these conditions are bad, and in some cases these market-based conditions are good. The problem is that when they are good, and that's when they are most vital to use, it is impossible for states to implement them due to the many black holes of incentives that government provides. That is the direct and intense pressure coming from farmers to never do this policy, or the fact that once you start spending on this, inflation increases the price of having to do this in the first place, which means you need to keep spending on incentive subsidies further and further. You need to keep controlling the market rate, and also the collective action problem that means you're afraid of other countries screwing you over. The important thing here is, one, the IMF acts as a collectivizing body to ensure that there's no collective action problem in the first place, but beyond that, it's an opportunity to displace blame and also have a replacement for the short-term incentive. If you're harming farmers in one way, you have the capacity to alleviate them or pacify them by giving them roads, by giving them hospitals. And the important thing here is that these incentives
incentives are very, very deeply important because in the cases where they're most needed, that is in the case where the country is most corrupt, where the country is most likely to do bad things, and where fuel subsidies are most likely to wreak havoc on the environment, on inflation, which is where the debate is most deeply situated because that's where the margin would really realistically happen in the first place. It is only when you provide an external incentive to allow these countries to actually do it in the first place, which means presuming every other team is correct, we show that it's important to force them to do this because there was no other way that they would be able to do this, but despite the fact that they deeply, deeply need it. Oppose.
We good?
Yeah.
First things first, refutation of closing opposition. Their first argument is you widen the pool of loans. Their first mechanism is that countries can just set favorable rates to pay off loans in rates that add no value to lenders, and this deters lenders. Two responses. One, countries can't just sharply appreciate their currency with no control whatsoever. Apart from the fact that they often don't have foreign currency reserves that allow them to engage in this appreciation, there are also strong disincentives for them to engage in this appreciation, which is that local businesses, in order to gain meaningful profits, have to sell to other richer countries that can pay them more money, that if their currency appreciates really substantially, the price of their exports go up and other countries don't buy their goods anymore. Therefore, you do not have the political incentive to appreciate your currency in a way that allows you to pay off a loan in a valueless way. Therefore, investors aren't deterred for this reason. Their second mechanism is that random populism often means that countries can set arbitrary interest rates in really bad ways, and investors are scared of this random populism. Flip this argument. Populism is more likely on their side when the IMF sets these conditions. The reason why is that these countries are forced to comply with politically unpopular conditions domestically as a condition for receiving a loan to let themselves out of crisis. These countries are politically beholden to anti-colonial forces, no thank you, that are against the IMF, that tell them, look, you already were beholden to the IMF in this way, you cannot get further concessions out of that. That creates a much stronger political incentive for these countries to engage in random populism in the future. An example of this is they are more likely to do things like control their central banks or capture central banking institutions, because they worry that because the future politician is like, look, these interest rate controls were really bad for our economy, they use short-termist political incentives to do things like capture central banks. No. Thirdly, they talk about long-term consequences of their decisions. I think Vivian's extension explains why politicians in developing countries often internalize long-term consequences in the short term. An important reason for this is the expectation spiral, which is if investors think that your economy's long-term future is really bad and they can't make money off you, that's a negative expectation for the future that shuts out investment right now, and therefore even short-termist governments have strong political incentives to act in their long term. But I have two high-level responses to the claim on widening the pool on loans. Number one, the reason lender states fund the IMF is because they are directly impacted by IMF loans. The IMF's job is to maintain currency stability. A recession in a developing country creates substantial amounts of currency risk, and developing countries have higher real interest rates. So the US, for example, has a lot of investors investing in developing countries who would lose their money if their currency crashed. That's why the US, no fact, contributes so much funding to both the IMF and the status quo. It's why Ghana got a bailout. Second of all, existing loans exist. However, substantially more loans being available in the future is often a bad thing. The reason why is it creates moral hazard, which is if countries think they can always be bailed out by the IMF in the future because IMF funding increases substantially on their side, that increases the risk that these countries take on enormous amounts of debt in a way that could potentially fuel them into a debt crisis in the future. So it's not even clear the closing opposition extension is a good thing. Second, on the incentives black hole, they basically say you face direct intense pressure from farmers in the future, which never changes. Their main mechanism is you solve a collective action problem because the IMF is able to aggregate many countries together. The problem is many countries aren't experiencing debt crisis, in which case those countries maintain their fertilizer subsidies while other countries don't. So there's no actual collective action problem that you're solving. In fact, intense pressure from farmers and capture of the political system by them is more likely in the long term if in the short term you give up this incentive to the IMF. Second thing, no, refutation of opening opposition. Firstly, they talk about dominant firms crowding out smaller firms using subsidies. One, I think lacking capital or scale, it is much harder to purchase fuel or subsidies for a smaller firm. Therefore, it's their side of the house if their countries do comply, where barriers to entry are substantially higher. When the manufacturing of things like fertilizers is only done by a few companies, prices are jacked up. That means only big companies in these industries can purchase them, and that reduces competition substantially, flipping the opening opposition case. Second of all, governments don't give existing dominant companies massive subsidies in the manner that opening opposition claims. The reason why is a strong incentive for government subsidies in the first place is to lower prices for average consumers who vote in elections. However, a dominant corporation with monopoly power doesn't use the subsidy to lower prices in a meaningful way, and that's a strong political disincentive to just give subsidies in a way that favors large corporations but does not, favor voters in elections in these countries. Second, on reducing central bank credibility. One, central banks have incentives to anchor expectations in stable ways because they care about their credibility, because that affects every policy that they do. It's unclear why central banks will behave in an uncredible way. Second, in the long term, as I explained, central banks are more likely to be captured by the backlash that results from this on their side of the house than ours, and central bank independence gets eroded. Their third claim is about lacking predictability. I have three responses. One, I think countries can send signals if they really care about predictability for what their future policy actions will be. And investors will often believe them. Second, predictability is not inherently good. If you expect a future currency crash, that creates a self-perpetuating cycle where you pull back your funding even more, and that makes the currency crash a lot worse. In many cases, predictability is bad to insure yourself against really damaging economic recessions and prevent them from turning into spirals. Third, this knifes their own argument on people who just invest by betting on a floating currency spot. If you can predict the currency spot more, you're more likely to invest by betting on the currency spot than if you can bet on a currency spot less. Thus, their argument knifes the rest of their case. No, thank you. Then they talk about why basically investment in the status quo goes away. One, they talk about regulatory oversight and corruption. Flip this argument. If you do not have a formal subsidy system, it is more likely that the manner in which big companies get access to subsidies is doing things like informal systems where governments give them things like kickbacks in a genuinely corrupt and damaging way, flipping their claim on corruption. Finally, on their claim on a floating exchange rate, it's easier to make bets on timing the currency spot. I actually think timing currency to international markets is really terrible because it hurts your ability to respond to shocks that are unique with your economy and not to others. Opening.
We told you, and CEO repeated in much better English, that the IMF and international investors writ large are vastly more willing to loan money when they have a set of predictable market conditions. That also breaks up agribusiness, your only extension over OGM.
Yeah, I just explained why. First, there are existing incentives on part of the IMF. Second, the IMF's incentives to lend out get so much worse that it creates large amounts of moral hazard. Let's talk about our extension. Our extension was not just about agribusiness. Let me actually collapse on the extension Vivian had that closing government entirely dropped. Look, opening government's entire reasoning for why governments are good at decisions and the IMF is bad at decisions is governments care about the economy. They do not tell you why elections are meaningfully representative of the people, or why governments care about the economy in a manner that affects the long term rather than just the short term. Vivian gives you the mechanisms for why the government does care about the economy and has meaningfully good incentives. So there are short-term costs of long-term decisions because expectations of future harm hurt you now. The governments have strong incentives to make elections representative and a game-theoretic incentive to get past things like lobbying. The reason this beats the opening half is all of opening government's arguments are contingent on the IMF being structurally better at making decisions. What Vivian's extension shows is the culture of neoliberalism. The resources being spread too thin and the lack of any meaningful good incentives means developing countries having long-term incentives, and representative elections is logically prior to the entire top half. Propose.
We thank the government whip for that speech. We welcome the opposition whip to conclude the quarterfinals of today.
The temptation in motions like this is always to do the same thing. Throw out a million impacts, why it might be good for some states, bad for some states, assert a context, never link it to the crisis, and call every other theme uncomparative. What we demonstrate in extension is that the debate isn't just about what's good for individual states, because the IMF doesn't make decisions for individual states. It makes them for a network, both of creditors and lenders. And what we explain uniquely, not just in better English, but better analysis, first, that this is the only way to prevent states from undercutting each other and actually getting good developmental outcomes, but secondly, that this is the only way to ensure that donor states retain the trust in the IMF necessary to lend at competitive rates. Because government has pretended as if they will continue to give this money freely. If you don't have conditions, you have higher interest rates, you have more severe austerity measures in the long run. It's not a free lunch on your side of the house, it's a harder lunch to repay. Let's first deal with CG and Farm Bill. I want to note that they make no attempt to defend their constructive case in that government speech, which I think tells you everything. At most they defend 1/3 of the conditions. Congrats, you get 1/3 of the debate, you lose on 2/3. But further, I point out that the mechanisms they give don't individually stand up to scrutiny. It's not clear why more use of fertilizer in and of itself is a good thing, especially when David explains that the kind of rapid acceleration of agriculture you get as a result of policies is the type of thing that erodes topsoil, steers farmers away from more innovative means of agricultural development. But secondly, in addition to that, I point out that it's not just about one state. Individual states might make farming cheaper. The problem with that is they're also buying more fertilizer and making it more expensive for the states that are actually good at agriculture and actually have the competitive advantage to continue buying agriculture. So the macro effect of this is that you raise food prices and make it more difficult for people to engage. Let's engage with the responses they give our extension. They gave us 3 mechanistic things. The first thing they say is, well, you can't peg your currency that high because you don't have the foreign reserves to do it. This responds to their own case because in many instances, if you guys are saying that you want governments to independently set currency, but you have no capacity to peg your currency on that side of the house because you don't have the foreign reserves, then it's unclear why you get any of the apologies OG talks about. The second thing they say is it's populist because it looks like the IMF is doing it. These guys say you will consult the IMF. What are you going to do? Hide the white guy behind the curtain and say he didn't tell me to do it. This is ridiculous. They will know who the policy came from. The third thing they say is, well, states have some long-term incentive. And this one is fair, but it's about a way up of the long-term incentive states too. And this is where David's second extension is particularly crucial. He explains that the reason this policy is bad is because it skews the long-term incentives of politicians. It's always easier to keep trying to keep your currency to a peg so that you can keep winning in international markets, to keep trying to subsidize agriculture when it's become clear that you're not competitive, you're not the best actor to do it, and irresponsibly funneling money into it, which is why states and politicians continue to engage in it. Once they've attached their name to the policy, it becomes so much harder for them to renege and adopt the good development policy we talk about. Their second extension is to say, well, states have an incentive to lend anyways. Yes, but it's about how that incentive manifests. On our side, we say the things that predatory states will turn to, like higher interest rates on loans, like lending to less states because they don't trust anyone as much, is far, far worse. And I just want you to take note of the comparative. These guys say it's bad when people starve. You make people starve for 5, 10 years after the crisis because they either had no money in the moment or because they had no capacity to repay. Second thing, what are the incentives of these states? Why are they on their own problematic? And why is it only IMF intervention that corrects them? This is where our top half is logically incoherent. OG is self-defeating. They say states want to do good, but our claim is that these policies are good. So if states want to do good, there's no reason that they would reject these conditions to begin with, which is why they accept and why you have no reason for removing them. So it gives you a bunch of stock reasons why these conditions are good, which is incredibly vulnerable to the gov response that you wouldn't need to impose them as states would come to them anyway. So why face the threat of rejection on OO? Why face the additional burden of imposing these or removing these conditions on OG? This is where David's extension is crucial in 3 ways. First, it responds to OG's entirely absent counterfactual. They assert that states wanting good economic outcomes magically leads to good decisions. We explain that their incentives are actually misaligned for good outcomes. Because states, when they individually do this, always have incentives to peg their currency lower, always have incentives to make our exports artificially more attractive, which is why none of them individually want to take the IMF loan. Because if I'm the Philippines, I can't trust that Malaysia might just lower its currency emergency the next day. This is why the loan condition has to come from the IMF, because it's the only one with collective control about what the network of states does in response to the crisis. That's when you create the network of trust necessary to gain lenders. And I want to know, this is where you flip the China extension from them. It's not enough for OO to say, well, China is weak right now. That obviously doesn't answer the long term, and they also still have a lot of money. The problem is, in your world, states are more likely to turn to China because they aren't sure that their rival states and rival export states won't result to the types of bad policies we ourselves are discussing. It's in our world where we can give them the assurance that we're imposing the same conditions on everyone, and thus the game is fair. The second reason the extension wins is because it supersedes top half on whether these conditions are marginally better or worse for states. There's a multitude of cases, some in which subsidizing agriculture is good, some in which it's bad. The only thing you're guaranteed to is that access to capital is good, and that low interest rates and having an easier time to repay them is good. We're the only team that explains where the loan money goes. But thirdly, we largely win the incentive debate, because our expansion explains why there's a margin. It states not just more willing to borrow from the IMF as a result of these conditions, but states more willing to lend over time and engage in favorable conditions, which wins. I'll take OG.
To avoid opening opposition's regional crisis and closing oppositions never being repaid, states have an incentive to pay back the loan, for which they need monetary flexibility, which you take away with a fucking shit policy.
But there are competing incentives. They have a political incentive to appease their people, and they have an economic incentive to pay back the loan. The problem is when you allow them to engage in irresponsible policy, the incentive to appease the people through irresponsible policy is what takes over and leads to the black hole circulation that David talks about. In our world, the incentive to do economically good projects like building roads and long-term development infrastructure is what supersedes, because it's the only incentives these states have. Secondly, where are states more likely to cooperate with the IMF? And I want to know, this is where the impact distinction matters, right? Our claim isn't just that these states accept loans from the IMF, it's that more states become willing to cooperate with the IMF in the long run as a result of these conditions being imposed now, and you maintaining that trust in a period of crisis. So it's not just that these states will accept these loans as they are currently, it's that states will be more willing to repay those loans, more willing to engage in the types of long-term developments that we care about this debate, rather than simply prioritizing the short-term incentives they might have. What we prove above all else is that this is a network of states that you need to care about. It's not enough to say that what's good enough for one is good enough for all. For all of those reasons, oppose.